Well, good morning and good afternoon for some of us. Welcome to Beyond Compliance. My name is Aaron Bolshaw with Safety Chain Software and the moderator of Beyond Compliance. For those of you possibly joining us for the first time, this is a periodic industry update for process manufacturers, food and beverage, non-food. Our goal is really to bring you insights around the market that shape the way we grow our businesses, deliver quality products to customers, mitigate supply chain risks, safeguard our brands, and all while improving yields and maximizing productivity. Not an easy feat, certainly. But today we're getting into a crowd favorite, audits. We're going to cover how to design internal audits to improve results across your customer, third-party, and regulatory compliance audits. And we are joined by none other than Mérieux NutriSciences, who are the experts in this space. So we're super happy to have them aboard, as we are happy to have everyone aboard. The webinar series is sponsored by Safety Chain Software, which is the #1 plant management platform, uniting compliance, safety, quality, and production. But enough about us. I'd rather get into the fun stuff. So before we start, I just want to set the table. Everyone can hear the moderator and the presenters, but we can't hear you. However, if you would, with those questions, we do want to get to those. We do want to hear from you. Use the console over to your right there and drop us questions. We'll save those for the end of the presentation. Tracy's got a ton to cover today, so we want to get through as much as we can. So, and we are scheduled for about an hour. We will remain flexible with our time, but I think we're going to have some really great questions, some detailed ones, possibly about your own facilities coming up. So, looking forward to that. Without further ado, I would like to present today's expert here. Tracie Sheehan is the VP of Technical Services at Mérieux NutriSciences. The epitome of been there, done that, 30 years of experience, Chief Health, Quality, and Sustainability Officer, SVP Food Safety, Sarah Lee Kellogg, PhD from University of South Carolina in analytical chemistry, which I didn't even know was a thing, Tracy. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Beyond Compliance.
Thank you, Aaron. And for those of South Carolina fans, our mascot is the Gamecocks, and it is a thing. So even analytical chemistry is a thing. So thank you very much. And we really appreciate Safety Chain offering us this opportunity to talk about internal audits. And so we wanted to kind of share with you some of the overall work that we do at Mérieux NutriSciences. We have a separate LLC that does the GFSI types of audits like SQF, BRC, FSSC, 22000, IFS, Global Gap, those types of audits. And then we also do a lot of other third-party audits like supplier audits. We do public training, online courses, and we have streaming videos. So we have a lot in the auditing and training space. We even have some services where we go and help companies develop internal audits. So I just want to give that broad background on our business before we get started.
Yeah, thank you.
And so the agenda, we kind of wanted to cover the purpose of food safety internal audits, and it's not just QA that's responsible for food safety internal audits. We want to cover some of the GFSI requirements. If your facility is GFSI benchmark certified, what are the customer requirements for internal audits? What are the regulatory reasons that you might be doing internal audits to get ready for regulatory inspections? And I will apologize up front, we're focused on the US for this session, but if you have any questions about global, we can either cover that in the Q&A or we can take it offline and help you with that. We talk about auditing personnel. So who should be doing your internal audits? What types of records should you be documenting when you do internal audits? What's your corrective actions and preventive actions? And then would you want to incorporate other types of audits? We have some interesting thoughts on that down the road. So that is the agenda for today.
Yeah, and we wanted to start out kind of, Trace, just setting the table with a question, everyone. So we're going to launch a poll here. I'm going to do this really quick. And what this will do is we really want to make sure we understand who's all around us. We've got hundreds of people on the webinar. So, and we're going to ask just a simple question about what types of audits that your company currently conduct. So this will open up on your screens individually. We'll ask that you take a second to fill this out. We don't know who's saying what, but we do want to hear from you. Are you doing food safety and quality assurance, internal audits, lab, sanitation? How about ingredient supplier? Got to check, make sure quality's coming in, right? Packaging supplier audits also. So take some time. I've got about only 44%. So if you're shy, don't be shy. We want to hear from you. This is helping us to understand who in the audience we have and what kinds of audits you're conducting. Again, this is select one or more. You don't have to just select one. So if you're thinking just you wanted the one. So, and I'll wrap this up and I'll ask Tracie, you to kind of see, in general, what you think. So just a couple more seconds here. I'll close this poll. Oh, you guys are great. We got 72% of you voted, 73, 74. I love these audiences, Tracie. They're so engaged. Let me close this real quick and we'll show the results to everyone, okay? And again, it'll just take a couple of seconds. So pop up a little bar chart on everyone's screen. Well, there you go. Everybody answered food safety and quality. So we definitely knew we'd have that in here. A little less on lab audits, but then a kind of a mix through all of these, Tracie.
And that's great to know the types of audits that we're doing in the facilities. And I think it's important to look at where GFSI is headed with these internal audits, especially on the lab side as well, and some of those requirements. But it
Nope, yeah, no, go for it. I just closed that so we could get back. I think that's right, the lab side. We're hearing, at least from our customers, a little bit more stricter audits, wanting to design some better sort of lab audits, which is great. So I appreciate everyone that answered.
Thank you. And so let's talk about sort of the purpose for internal audits. I always think it's important to start there. You know, your number one reason, and 99% of you are conducting internal audits. So you're doing that to protect your consumers. People are eating your food or your beverages, drinking your beverages, or taking your dietary supplements every single day. And you want to protect those consumers so you don't have an issue. So we'll talk about how internal audits can help you with that. We'll talk about compliance with the third-party audit schemes, satisfying your customer requirements, and we won't get into specific customers, but just a general overview of how you might want to look at incorporating customer requirements into your audits, complying with regulations, and then ultimately protecting your company from having food safety issues. And
there we go.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. So how do we protect consumers? I made that broad general statement. Most people, they're doing internal audits. They don't maybe think about the broader picture if they are routinely doing internal audits and not having major issues. But if you've ever worked at a facility where you've had, say, an outbreak for Salmonella, E. coli S-tech, Listeria, you could have a serious issue that you've caused consumers harm, and that can happen not necessarily in your facility. It could happen on the farm, and it comes in with ingredients. It could happen during processing. It could happen during distribution, although less likely, or things can happen at the home where cooks aren't necessarily cooking to a full temperature, or at a food service establishment. So you got to think about things holistically when you're designing your internal audits in order to protect consumers, especially from our microbiological hazards. And I'll use some examples for this. So when you design your internal audits, don't just make them checklists. Make sure your auditors know how to use their 5 senses and observations. And there's a place for observations that are, say, handwritten versus a yes/no answer. So train your internal auditors to use their senses. For example, sense of sight, you can look and see a roof leaking and dripping on product. That could be salmonella on the roof from birds that could be up there. So you're thinking holistically and using your senses. So smell, you can smell maybe an off odor in a spiral cooler or a drain that could be a microbiological hazard that's not yet identified. Or maybe you've swabbed the drain and you've identified what that issue is. You can use your hearing, and you could check for a grinder blade. Let's say you're grinding meat or you're grinding other ingredients. The blade breaks, and you could hear that as part of your internal audit or your operators as a sign of foreign material problems. Your sense of touch, and you want to be careful if you're touching equipment, everything's locked out and tagged out. But does the equipment have a slimy feel at pre-op? And that could be an indication of a biofilm, like then Listeria monocytogenes could be in that biofilm that did not get cleaned off during sanitation. So you want to think about how you might be able to uncover that in an internal audit. Sensory assessment, and I put for taste because we're not necessarily checking food safety for taste, but taste could be an indicator of conformance to specification. Does the product taste like you think it should? Or maybe there's an off taste that could lead to mold or microbiological spoilage. So it can be an indicator during an audit, either on an annual basis or every day. So just something to think about of using the senses versus a standardized checklist. So what does GFSI have to say, the Global Food Safety Initiative? They set benchmark standards around the world. And so they tell us, or they tell the certification program owners like SQF and BRC what they should be auditing towards. So their statement is an internal audit needs to be established and implemented and maintained to cover the scope of your whole food safety management system. It should be risk-based and include microbiological, environmental monitoring programs, and established, implemented, and maintained. So that's in a broad sense what GFSI sets for all the individual audit types. But if we switch to the certification program owners' internal requirements, and I'm just going to read a few things from these CPOs that cover internal audits. So for example, if you're SQF certified, your practitioners are required to complete HACCP training. It's a minimum of 2 days duration, and there's testing for competency. The training is certified HACCP and internal auditing with a licensed SQF training center like Mérieux NutriSciences. It can fill this requirement. SQF also requires scheduling and conducting the internal audits to verify the effectiveness at least annually. Staff conducting these internal audits have to be trained, and where practical, shall be independent of the function being audited. And this is sometimes a challenge for facilities because maybe your QA manager is your SQF practitioner, and maybe they are auditing for the SQF compliance, but they could be over the same area that they're auditing. So often SQF looks at secondary SQF practitioners as a backup so that you're not auditing your own work, as an example. SQF also requires that environmental testing results be monitored for preventive actions and implemented with, if there's unsatisfactory results, that trends are done and corrective actions. And, as a comparison, BRC requires the internal audit on at least 4 different audit dates spread throughout the year. So they're very specific about their requirement and when that internal audit needs to happen. I think both or all the certification bodies are very broadly say that annual is not enough. They need to be on a routine basis. A most common or practice is monthly and breaking that internal audit into monthly segments. And the other thing I'll just put out, at the minimum, the inspections need to include hygiene inspections, cleaning, housekeeping, fabrication of equipment, so sanitary design, and then also, really make them risk-based on the things that you're having challenges with that need to be corrected. And the challenges could include your supplier approval process, or your prerequisite programs like pest control or food defense or food fraud. So I just want to, in a broad sense, every CPO has different exact requirements, but in a broad sense, it's important to know that you can also incorporate all of those learnings from all the CPOs into your own internal audit program.
Mm.
All right, this is one that's new with GFSI, is they have now asked that a procedure be established to maintain and ensure the analysis of food critical to the confirmation of food safety are undertaken by competent laboratories using appropriate sampling and testing methods such that the analysis are in compliance with the applicable requirements of ISO 17025. So, in a broad sense, this means that, like, for example, Mérieux NutriSciences certificate labs are all accredited to ISO 17025. So if you're sending a Listeria, Salmonella, whatever test to Mérieux, you're in compliance with this standard. But if you're doing your own testing, it's important to know that, you know, you're going to need, your own lab will need access control for the restricted authorized personnel. You want to make sure that your lab personnel do not contaminate product if they've been handling Salmonella as a control sample. You want to make sure that it's housekeeping and sanitation protocols are in place. You want to monitor your environment for the lab, just like you monitor your environment for manufacturing. And this may be things like monitoring the air, the surface, the hand samples. And I just put EnviroMap there. It's our own tool that all of our labs use, as well as we sell it to customers for monitoring environmental compliance. You want to make sure that you're tracing, linking all the events from the start of testing to producing the final result. And then the one challenge is a lot of the manufacturing labs need to add proficiency testing if it's for food safety. So proficiency testing may be things like an allergen proficiency test. If allergens are a food safety hazard in your facility, it may mean some microbiological proficiency testing. The personnel need to be trained in the lab, and then of course, precision and accuracy performance have to be monitored and documented. So when you design these customer internal audits, you also want to include what your customers want you to do. And, you know, just as an example, the customers may ask for GFSI audits, they may ask for other third-party audits, they may do their own audits. Your customer's ingredient and finished food specifications, they may include compliance of certificates of analysis, environmental monitoring, maybe they include metal detector limits. You just want to think about when you're putting that on the internal audit, that you're checking that you're complying with the customer requirements.
That's fantastic. Interesting. You know, we also want to kind of bring people back in here. Tracie, we want to ask one more poll. So just like we did before, we're going to ask a very simple question. I'm going to launch this, which is what best describes your job function, okay? So before we get kind of into that side, I'm going to launch this poll. Same time, let's see if we can beat that 75%, everybody. Again, we're just asking you to quickly select one of these. If you're sitting in a conference room, maybe a few of you around the computer, pick on somebody. Just pick one of them, if you will. So, and I can see the results coming in really quick. Okay, good, good. Interesting, because we wanted Tracie to put a couple of people or functions on here to spur some thought here. Finance, you normally don't see in these types of presentations, do we, Tracie? Right? But we could. There is a financial impact, right? Chief executive officer, owner, operator, agent in charge. Those are the people that should have good awareness of this. So I'm going to close this poll. We got past 75%. You guys are awesome. Let's share the results here. And I'm not surprised by this, but I'd love yeah, right?
And it's great to see some of the sanitation team on, and glad to know that we have 2% that are CEO, owner, operator, or agent in charge. And I'll maybe go to the next slide, Aaron.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I do want to say, some people might be scratching their heads, well, why, should we have had maintenance in here or something like that? It is a team effort. Anything that goes on inside your plant has to be a team effort. And I think that that's just one of those things. We appreciate everyone taking that poll. That'll be the last one that we do, Tracie. So why don't you continue?
Well, and some of you may recognize that language about owner, operator, or agent in charge. So if you've taken the Food Safety Modernization Act or FSMA training for being a preventive controls qualified individual, which everyone in every facility should have one of those, that language says that that person who's in charge of that whole facility is the person who is responsible for the food safety of that facility. It doesn't say the QA manager, it doesn't say the sanitation manager, the maintenance manager. It is the owner, operator, or agent in charge, and that's the way the regulation was written. And that's kind of why we ask that question, is because a lot of times QA people feel like they are the only person that is responsible for the internal audit, and that sometimes it's a burden or seen as, oh, they're coming around again, let's get ready. And really, it should be the entire organization in a facility that is part of that internal audit, and each person has a role to play. That's our opinion for internal audit best practices. So I want you to imagine that you're back in 1641. Yes, that was a year when Massachusetts first put their official inspection of beef, pork, and fish. And you may not be in that industry, but can you imagine the inspector and the internal audit team walking around with a candle looking for non-compliances? So in 1902, the FDA had the poison squad, and FDA, this group would actually taste food to see if it was poisonous. That committee did not last very long. You got other things that were invented between there. You got the lantern and the flashlight, and everybody knows you're using a flashlight to do audits. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is what all of our U.S. manufacturing are complying with, except for the meat and poultry guys. So, and focused on FSMA in 2011. And now we've got a new era of smarter food safety. And that really, there's a lot of software automations that have come that impact how we do food safety in facilities. So the purpose of food safety internal audits in the United States, FSMA makes it the owner, operator, agent in charge of the facility, and they are liable to monitor the effectiveness of the food safety programs and monitor the corrective actions and that they get done. So it's not good enough to just have an internal audit where you have a corrective action and it never gets done. You want to make sure that you're taking appropriate action to reduce the likelihood of recurrence or failure. And all effective food is evaluated for safety, and then all effective food is prevented from entering commerce. So that's the regulatory requirement for FSMA on the FDA side. Similar approach on the meat and poultry side, but you want to make sure that whatever you design in internal audit includes your regulatory requirements. So how are we doing? And I just pulled this data from the US FDA Regulatory Inspection Observations for the last year on record. These are the top 11 reasons that an FDA inspector writes a 483, which is meaning that the facility did not comply. So number one on the list, the facility did not develop a foreign supplier verification program for any ingredients that they themselves import or are imported through a supplier. Number two is pest control, because very often you can see, if you're an inspector, you can see where that pest control goes wrong. And then you get on into the hazard analysis is ineffective, a lot of things around the food safety plan, supplier evaluation, approval, sanitary operations. And then I wanted to make sure I included this one at the end. They're citing for equipment and utensils are not designed properly. And the reference is provided here if you have any questions. So I think it's important as you're looking at in your internal audits that you focus on the things that the regulatory inspector is focusing on as well to make sure that you reviewed that. So all these things on suppliers need to be part of your internal audit program, just like pest control likely is. So let's say you talked about US regulation, let's look at global. So Mérieux has an expert services web portal. We offer software services for Safety HUD, which tracks global recalls around the world. So let's say you're manufacturing in a state in the US, but you're shipping to 3 other countries around the world, and you want to know what the main issues are in those countries from a recall perspective, what you're likely to have as a risk. You can look it up in Safety HUD, and it also has food fraud data. So what is the most likely ingredient to have food fraud? So you can design your internal audits around that. You can look at limit detector, and this may have things like aflatoxin, which is a mycotoxin that occurs in grain. The limit for aflatoxin in the United States is different than the limit in Europe. So if you're exporting to Europe, you want to know that. And you want to design that you're in control, not only for the US on your internal audit, but for wherever you're shipping. And then regulatory update just gives customers a way to know about different regulations that are happening around the world. So I just thought we'd share that. So if we look at global regulatory compliance, what are the main reasons that people are not complying and having recalls? 26% due to biological, or as we might say, microbiological recalls. Allergens still is near the top of the list globally for 23% of recalls. Chemical recalls are more common in Europe, and the leader on that is pesticides. But it also, or ethylene oxide maybe this past year, but it also includes global chemical recalls that are not allergens. Labeling still is a number 4 list, and Mérieux offers labeling reviews and compliance, but we're still seeing a lot of label recalls around the world happening. Composition, where ingredients are not accurately stated other than allergens. Physical, meaning form, material, and then other. Oops, sorry. So how often does your internal audit check your labels for regulatory compliance? Very often the supplier changes the ingredient information for allergens or a food additive, and they don't notify you. Some companies will put in a time limit in their contracts so that the company has to notify them of supplier ingredient changes. Maybe your packaging printer missed a line on the ingredient statement. And these are all examples that we've seen in discussions with our labeling team working with clients. Maybe the allergen contained statement doesn't match the allergens in the ingredient statement. The new company owner didn't even know there were legal requirements for the food product name. The illegal nutrient content claims and health claims. If you're making a nutrient content claim, you want to make sure you've got some testing to back up that content claim so that if a regulatory inspector asks you, you can show them, oh, I have this internal audit document and I've got this testing to show that I'm in compliance. Maybe the exported food was not compliant with labeling regulations in the country of sale. We know that US food ends up in a lot of different markets, and not all with the labeling that is required for that country. I mean, even US and Canada labeling does not agree, let alone other countries, and we're neighbors. All right. So one of the other big misses, I think, is how companies really audit their crisis management. Most companies will include a traceability exercise where you're looking at ingredients or packaging or finished food, and you want 100% recovery during that traceability exercise. But a lot of companies on their internal audit, they're not necessarily doing a mock recall scenario or a real crisis management for things like a foodborne outbreak. Imagine that you had that salmonella outbreak and FDA calls and says they've traced a salmonella outbreak to your location, what are your plans? So you want to make sure your internal audit covers that. Let's say a consumer calls and said they had an allergic reaction or a death attributed to your food. What's your plans and next steps? And your internal audit should double check that all those plans are updated. Or a sharp metal object ingested by a customer's child. And then regulatory inspector wants to take samples. We always recommend that you have a procedure in place, and we can help develop that if you don't. We have consultants who do this. What if the inspector wants to take swabs for Listeria monocytogenes? What if the inspector wants to take grain samples for mycotoxin testing or allergen testing? So you want to think about all the different scenarios that happen in the industry and how to be prepared for that with your internal audit and your food safety programs. So I like to always cover corrective actions and preventive actions. People think they're the same thing sometimes. So a corrective action is something that you do relatively quickly and you fix a problem, let's say in an audit. The auditor's there, they issue a non-conformance, and you correct it and you document that you corrected it. A preventive action is something you may implement that will prevent that non-conformance from happening again. I think a lot of companies struggle with how to implement preventive actions to actually prevent food safety issues. You want to align on the timeline for implementation across the entire facility, and that includes, maintenance may require capital expenditures, and that's why I included finance on the list of people to include in the training. You may have to go up to the CEO for approval, and you want to make sure that timeline is reasonable and funded. And then you want to verify and document that you completed and closed out that corrective action, including if you had to invest in new equipment, like a new metal detector, new swabbing procedures based on your findings. And then look at it as always continuous improvement. Companies are always getting better at food safety compared to where we were in, I guess, the 1600s. It's been a continuous improvement journey, and I think a lot of companies maybe don't get the credit they deserve for all the changes and improvements they've made in food safety. So thank you. External audit, food safety types. Some of you mentioned that you're doing supplier audits or packaging audits. And I'll just use the others: on-farm and produce audits for some companies, logistics and sanitary transportation audits that we do, packaging suppliers, co-manufacturers, warehouses. Think about everybody that gives you something and how do you audit them in your internal audit program and make sure that they are in compliance with what your expectations are. So some companies will include like an annual review of these programs as part of their documentation so that they can demonstrate that to an auditor. You want to design the food safety internal audits to also include maintenance and sanitation, and that's why I included those special folks in the list. Maintenance is the group that keeps the facility running. Without maintenance, you generally don't have equipment to run, and want to make sure that they're a part of the internal audits and that they feel included and they feel responsible and they're a good partner with you to get internal audit changes made. Sanitation, you want to make sure that the sanitation team is a partner and they're making changes and that you're seeing in internal audits. And very often a sanitation, some advanced companies will have sanitation auditing maintenance and maintenance auditing QA and a wide variety of kinds of things. Start out with the basics. Start out with all the sanitation training that's needed, what sanitation verification looks like and how you evaluate that in an internal audit. And then I mentioned the capital expenditures for progress in your food safety compliance. Some companies, and I'll put this on here because some companies that I've worked with in the past have audits for, say, employee safety, ethical audits, environmental compliance like waste treatment facilities, sustainability claims, financial audits for, say, Sarbanes-Oxley in the US. And there are companies that think you can audit for all of this in one audit, including food safety. And our opinion is these need to be separate audits, because your food safety audits have FDA regulatory compliance, whereas your employee safety may have OSHA regulatory compliance. So make sure that everything is covered in your facility, but the recommendation would be to maybe consider separate audits for each of those if you need to do them. Mentioned suppliers before. I just like these graphs because right now with FDA, the latest numbers is there are 211 different countries that have over 200,000 food facilities registered with the FDA that import ingredients into the US. So we also look at how many suppliers have GFSI certificates. There are 150 certificates based on the latest GFSI website numbers in 162 countries. So not every company that is registered with FDA is GFSI certified, and not every GFSI certified company is registered with FDA. I realize that, but you may have imports from countries that are neither. So first and foremost, if you're a US company, you want to make sure you're complying with US FDA regulations on imports, and that the facility that's importing for you is registered. And second of all, best practice is to look at GFSI or some other audit type to assure there's a minimum food safety compliance. Designing internal audits to check compliance requirements. We talked about the supplier approval process. That includes the foreign supplier verification that I just covered, but also your domestic suppliers. Most US suppliers would be compliant with US regulations, but we often find that we uncover things in internal audits that we maybe are surprised about, even with domestic suppliers. Ingredient approval process. You want to make sure your ingredients as part of your internal audit are either approved as a food additive, approved under generally recognized as safe process, or some other methodology if you're importing from another country. You want to make sure your packaging is approved. Not only is your label compliant with all the allergen information, but anything that's food contact, touching your food, all the ingredients that go into that food contact packaging material need to go through an approval process, and that should be checked in your internal audits. Switch gears a little bit. So who should be doing internal audits? If you look at the auditors trained, need to be trained and competent in food safety with documented training records. This may be a HACCP certificate like Mérieux offers. It could be other equivalent training records. You want to make sure they're knowledgeable in regulations that are required for the reasons we stated before. They should be independent and not audit their own work. And I mentioned that this is a challenge sometimes, but that's a GFSI recommendation. So, you know, look at either multiple people in the same department or different departments auditing. Supplier and co-manufacturer auditors have to be competent and have documented training records. They should have prior knowledge of that ingredient that they're auditing, or packaging material or co-manufacturing industry, so they know what the best practice is for that supplier, packaging, or co-manufacturer. Designing audit records, paper or digital. You want to demonstrate regulatory compliance, and a lot of people don't necessarily think about this, but your internal audit document not only points out the things that you don't conform to, but you need to make sure that you document when you conformed. If you walked through 1 month and you were in complete compliance with every single thing, and you covered environmental monitoring, you covered all the allergen programs, you covered all the food safety critical things, you want to make sure you document that. But in the effort of continuous improvement, if you're going through on a monthly basis, you want to document any nonconformity. You don't want to miss things and not document them. If you document a nonconformity, you should assign the personnel responsible for the activity audited and who's going to take care of the Kappa and who will execute it and what's the due date, and close the loop. Never leave a nonconformity open. In your internal audit, in a third-party audit, in a regulatory inspection, you want to make sure you've documented that you've closed the loop. And then finally, or wrapping up again, is protect your consumers. Never ship the food that could cause harm. Many times in an internal audit, you may discover something that the food is out of code date, the allergen declaration is incorrect. Make sure you put that food on hold, and if needed, document destruction of the unsafe food with pictures, and make sure that it doesn't get out to consumers.
Fantastic. Oh, this is great, Tracie. I've got so many thoughts here. I want to thank you for going through this. We do have some questions coming through. I'm going to introduce everyone to Kirsten in just a second, who will take a couple of those. But I have just a couple of thoughts. First of all, earlier on, Tracie, you were talking about designing the audit for senses and observation versus that checklist mentality. And I think that's super important to just revisit. We're all going to have to use a checklist at some point, but I think when whether that's on paper or you use a digital method like Safety Chain or something like that, but this approach helps to empower that frontline worker to do the right thing and not just check boxes. There's a big difference culturally when you give people the ability to say, you want to mark the stuff that you see confidently, knowing that there is going to be a continuous improvement action, whether that's a Kappa or RCA, whatever that looks like. You want to make sure they're empowered to find stuff and then resolve it, because it's really the point there. It's not just checking lists. So I appreciate that, Tracie. That's a really good point you made.
Thanks, Aaron. And I have seen where an internal auditor observed something that was not correct in the past and did not write it down because it wasn't on the checklist. And so I always like a blank space that they can write in whatever they want.
That's a really good point. That's a great practice to kind of consider, which is and designing it to the senses, like you kind of pointed out, gives them that ability to say, wait a second, I'm going outside the check boxes here, and I'm going to really dive in and see what's going on. And that's really the spirit of the audits anyway. So the question that I think certainly our customers get, and I'm not going to guess some of the questions that Kirsten's going to give us, but the frequency of audits question is always hot topic. And I wanted to ask you something. We've got some thought leaders in our customer base, VP level sort of quality safety folks who are responsible for huge teams that are across hundreds of facilities. And a few of them have been talking about sort of what they're calling micro audits and daisy chaining audits. So instead of doing an internal audit that lasts, say, let's call it that 2 or 3 day thing, right, Tracie, where everyone's like, okay, we got to do this and get it all out. They're actually stretching that out over 3 weeks, sometimes 4 weeks, and instead breaking it up into smaller audits through that time and documenting all of them so that they're more almost like always prepared. Have you run into that? Is there any commentary you'd add to that? There might be some downfalls. I'm okay if that's possibly coming to your mind, but what are your thoughts on this micro audit sort of frequency?
Well, having been in the industry for 30 years, as you mentioned, I've seen the gamut. I've seen where it's done once a year. I've seen where it's done monthly, and I've seen, I think as we evolve into an entire facility having a food safety culture, it could evolve into every single person is looking at from an internal audit perspective every day. And maybe they're documenting things that they're seeing that are questionable, or at least raising their hand to their supervisor and saying, I know I'm not on the internal audit team, but I saw this on the allergen label that I read. We want to make sure that everyone feels empowered to be part of internal audits. Yeah,
very good point. Good point. And then I just wanted the last part, connecting those Kappas, and I think it was really cool. It was very, very close to the backside here. connecting the Kappas basically to that audit and showing the auditor, like when you really finally get to that audit point, you've got the auditor in your facility, et cetera. It's really important. One, you're going to build a lot of confidence with your auditor. Could you talk about what that does? You know, if you're able to connect and show that continuous improvement, you know, so, okay, great, you found something, there's a nonconformity, we documented it, we closed it, here's the actions that we did to improve it next time. What's that do for that confidence level of the auditor, like next time, and even in your experience, Tracie?
Well, and I think that it helps the confidence of the auditor, but it also helps the confidence of the inspector and the customer. And if you ever opened your plant to a consumer, which is rare, it would document the responsibility that you demonstrate for them. And I think it's important that we look at the preventive measures. So, for example, let's say you document that you've implemented a preventive action for metal detection, that you did something different so that you would never have a physical contaminant again. And I'm just being arbitrary here. So that, what do you do the next time that you have one? You want to make sure that anything you actually call a preventive measure is actually preventing. So in your internal audit, you want to look at all the things you put in place, let's say for the last period of time on preventive measures, and did we really prevent them, or do we need to relook at a preventive measure? And I'll just use an example of a barcode scanner on the line that checks labels either visually for allergens or scan-wise that's linked to the formula being run. That is more of a preventive measure that I got the right label on the line than a corrective action that I've got somebody looking at the line routinely and trying.
Yeah, that's a good point. I get it. Yeah. Good. All right. Well, Tracie, I'm going to turn this over to Kirsten, if you would. There are a few questions that have come in. Will you mind proctoring some of those for us?
Yes, absolutely. We have a very good, and I would say wide spectrum of questions. So thank you, Tracie, for your presentation, and also in advance for addressing some of these. The first one that we have relates back to when you were talking about traceability and mock recalls, and as more of a preparatory exercise. So besides a traceability exercise, what else would a mock recall entail?
Well, I've seen a wide variety of options. One example might be, let's say your executives in the facility, your sanitation leader, your maintenance leader, and your QA leader and owner operator sit down and say, there are scenario trainings that we can do. And we would hand them one document that says, FDA just identified an outbreak in your facility.
Mm-hmm.
And walk away.
Right.
And see what that group does in order to solve the problem, or what are their next steps. So the true test is if you were handed the opportunity, and then we would set up various scenarios after that of things that could happen down the road. Like they identified that you might be involved in an outbreak. Mm-hmm. Then 5 days later, they're sending an inspector in to swab. 10 days later, they're doing this, they're doing that. What has the company done in the meantime?
Right. I think that's a very good point. And also, you know, considering how you've interacted with other companies or suppliers, et cetera. I've heard the same thing, and that it could take a lot of different formats. And I've heard that format quite a bit as well. And it's important, you know, making sure that in the event in which you would need to provide documentation to the FDA within 24 hours, that you do have a process that supports that. So
yeah, and I think traceability is the base of all of that, mm-hmm. not the end game.
Right. I would agree with you there as well.
Thank you.
Just because we have a few more that we want to get to, I'm gonna move us along here. This one is more on the topic of Kappas. Do you have an example of a good Kappa process?
Oh, That's
I do. No, I'm just kidding. I don't want to take this from Tracie, but yeah, there's a lot of ways to slice that. So
Right.
Tracie, you're holding the grenade on that one.
Well, the first thing that we see a lot of times in an audit or a consulting is, let's say there was an allergen recall for a mislabeled product because the wrong label was applied. The first corrective action is, oh, I retrained the person to check the labels. That is not a corrective action because you got new people coming in all the time, especially in this day and age, and really retraining is not the corrective action. So I think designing what in your process with your equipment works to correct and prevent that label from going on the wrong product.
Yeah, agreed. And I think you highlight a good point in ensuring that you're not only correcting it, but then you're translating that into an action that ensures that it's prevented moving forward. So yes, I think, Amanda, thank you for your question. There are a few of these here that I know are kind of hard in a theoretical sense. We are going to get a little bit more specific. Tracie, the next one that we have is about auditing multiple schemes, and specifically internal auditing multiple schemes. So Tara's question is, how would you go about that? Internal auditing, for example, SQF, NSF, and organic, separate or together? How would you approach that? And I think I kind of know where you're going here, but I'll let you take it away.
Well, there are the best practice is to put them all together. So it takes some work, but like in Europe, very often BRC and IFS are required in the same facility, but based on the customer requirements. Rather than having two separate BRC and IFS checklists, it's better to merge them so that you're reducing the amount of work for the internal team. And a lot of those checklists are very similar, and you can develop a checklist that splits out automatically and recombines so that it's easier for your local team to implement, if that makes sense. So I'm a fan of one internal audit checklist that has everything that you want on it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then to your point about having a digital or paper record of that, then being able to go back and reference that moving forward, and you've got kind of your master consolidated data.
Right. BRC may want to see one thing, IFS wants to see another. Mérieux looks for certain things as a certification body because we do a lot of audits. You want to make sure that you can split it out based on who's doing the auditing, and also like split it out for your regulatory inspector. There are certain things that a regulatory inspector looks at that may be different than what SQF looks at. So you want to make sure your internal audit is combined but splittable based on who's asking.
Perfect. And Tara says thank you as well.
Okay.
We've got just a few more. I know we're coming up on the hour here. This one is related to an external supplier food safety audit. So in this example, for an external supplier food safety audit, if they are GFSI certified, is it sufficient to just have their audit report or results on file? I think this probably would depend in terms of what sufficient means, but go ahead and take it away.
Well, I think best practice is that you're not only requiring GFSI, you want to look at the actual report, what the nonconformities were, what the corrective actions, the preventive measures were, and also if they've had regulatory non-compliances, you want to make sure they're compliant with FDA registration. If you're importing, they've got a foreign supplier verification process. There's a whole list of things that sort of, in addition to GFSI, I think.
And that
regulatory
over time too, I think is right. Like as a potential non-conformance may arise, perhaps there's another audit that occurs internally. So I think that makes complete sense. All right, we've got one more that came in here. If we received a foreign body complaint in our product from our customer, and in response, we didn't find anything in our audit. How should we close the loop with the customer? So another, I think, finite specific example, but this question is about having a foreign body complaint in a product from a customer, but upon auditing, there was nothing found. So how to close the loop with that customer?
And I think the key is what you mean. If you just say nothing found, I think you haven't substantiated their concern. Mm-hmm. So let's say it's a bolt or it depends on what type of foreign material it is. You can do metallurgic analysis to identify the origin of it. You can know what your equipment is made of so that you know what types of foreign material are possible in your facility. Mm-hmm. You can compare that and do a thorough report for the supplier demonstrating that you've sufficiently investigated and ruled out the possibility of the foreign material in the facility. And I think when you're looking in your facility, foreign material can also come from your suppliers. So don't overlook the assessment of your ingredients.
Correct. I think that's a really great note to end on as well. Thank you so much for answering all these questions. I too have many things I could ask you, but I want to be respectful of our time. So Aaron, I will kick it back to you. But thank you so much, Tracie, and Aaron as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. So just a couple of things coming up, and a ton of people to thank behind the scenes here, by the way. First, speaking of continuous improvement, we do have another webinar coming up in March, coming up just a couple of weeks, about 3 key methods to unlock continuous improvement. The continuous improvement coaches at Safety Chain will be leading us through some exercises that are going to be kind of fun. So make sure you kind of mark your calendars for that. FSMA Friday coming up here, I think next week, something like that. Anyway, it's the psychology of product allergen labeling. The good folks at the Atchison Group helping us out there. Really cool presentation. Don't miss that one. And then going into March a little bit further, leveraging OEE to minimize downtime and maximize performance. So a lot of good stuff, but I do want to say there's some great resources on Mérieux's website. Please go over there and check that out. And we also, of course, have more at safetychain.com if you're ever interested. Seeing where we're at, what we're up to, go to our resources, webinars, and events. You can see all the cool stuff we're cooking up. Tracie, your team is always fantastic to work with. I just want to say thank you very, very much to you and Mark and everybody on your side that puts together such a thought-provoking, really, really valuable content and presentation, and for you for joining us. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Aaron and Jennifer. It's a great session.
And on the Beyond Compliance side, there's a lot of people in Safety Chain behind the scenes: Kiera, Hannah, Anne, Derek, Jennifer, Kirsten. A lot of people it takes to put on a good quality webinar, and we appreciate all your efforts. So with that, we'll wrap it up for today. And the best question that everyone usually asks, we're going to make sure everybody that registered or signed up or were here today with us do have access to all the materials you saw and a replay video here shortly in the next day or two. So look for that in your email inboxes. And until next time, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much from Beyond Compliance. This will end our presentation today. Cheers.